to see you. Andy, could you turn that down just a hair? Thank you. Okay, so tonight's session, we've got one person to thank, a few people to thank for it, but mostly I want to thank our sponsor for the class, Diane Landy, who's here tonight, who sponsored our class. Let's give her a round of applause. So how many of you had a chance to hear our guest speaker tonight on the radio yesterday? Did anybody have a chance to hear him? A few people. He was really, it piqued my interest so much. It's going to be a great session tonight. Right after he got off the radio, I don't know if any of you heard a comment from a caller. He's a frequent attendee of Empower You. His name is Carl. And have any of you been following this whole thing with Facebook about how they kind of decide who gets to put their messages online and who doesn't? Well, his question right after David got off, it really kind of surprised me was, will have any of the senators ask Mark Zuckerberg about Empower You being blacklisted from Facebook? And that took me back to about a year ago. Empower You, when the whole IRS conservative thing came out, Empower You was one of the first groups to be targeted. One of our speakers called me one day and said, I got a letter from the IRS asking me why I taught at an Empower You event. And I don't think our session with David tonight is going to have too much to do with conservatives or liberals or anything. I think it's just going to be a great session. But about a year ago, Facebook, we like to post our information about our sessions, and we put all of them on Facebook. And one day I posted a session on Facebook, and I got this message saying, you've been banned from Facebook forever, and this is not a reversible decision. And it was a debate. It was our debate between the Hamilton County Commissioners, Republicans and Democrats, that they had decided to ban us for. So what you're hearing about is very, very real. And if it ever happens to you, what I did, I got a hold of my attorney, and he said, write them back and tell them if they don't put you back on Facebook, we're going to sue them within 24 hours. And I heard from Facebook in about 6 hours. You know, if anything like that ever happens to you, I urge you to stand, stay your ground and stand up for yourself. It's called shadow banning. That's the term for it. So I wanted to introduce you to our great team tonight. We have Bill Roll, our treasurer, back there. Let's give him a round of applause. We've got Andy Scarth, our producer, back there. We've got Betty Overstreet, our community relations director, right back here. And I hope our executive director, Nita Thomas, is watching online. Let's say hello to her. Hi, Nita. And I wanted to tell you just about our few classes. We're about 3/4 of the way through our 15th semester, but we've got 4 great classes. A week from tonight, we're going to do something called painting with a twist. So if you're like me and you're very you're a business guy with no art ability, and you've always wanted to see if you could paint, next Thursday is going to be a great fun class with some great people. I hope you'll join us. And then the Tuesday after that, which would be a week from 2 days ago, gosh, this class is really popular. If you're going to come, I'm not going to ask you to register because it's going to be really tight. It's on the Beverly Hills Supper Club Fire, and kind of the main person who was there that night will be here, and he's going to walk us all through it. It's going to be really, really interesting. Something that's been added to that session, there is a Senate candidate from Cleveland. His name is Mike Gibbons, and he is going to be coming through, and he'll be talking the first 15 minutes of that session, introducing himself to you. We have no interest in whether he's good or bad or right or wrong. We're just going to give him a forum to meet you. Because it's such an important position, the U.S. Senate, and you'll have to vote in May on that. So you should meet the people that you're going to get a chance to vote for. So he'll be here before the first 15 minutes of the Beverly Hills Supper Club. After that, on 2 weeks from tonight, we will have Ron Wilson here from In the Garden. How many of you are gardeners out there? So gardeners. Yeah, I'm not very good at it, but he'll tell you about everything about your garden. It should be a great session. I don't know how many of you listen to him on the radio. I do. And then 2 weeks from last night will be our last class of the semester. It's going to be a great session. And we're going to have a good crowd. We've got Brian Thomas will be emceeing that night. We will be giving away empowered citizen certificates for those people that have attended 10 sessions in a year. We will have Christopher Smitherman here from the city of Cincinnati. It's been a really interesting week in the city of Cincinnati for those of you who have been following, because we've got these 5 council members that have been sued for not following the Open Records and Open Meetings Act. And I haven't had a chance to ask my friend Mr. Janis back there what he thinks about that, because we just hosted here and we had a sold out crowd. We had 100 people in here to teach elected officials the Open Records and Open Meetings Act. And here we have 5 council members in Cincinnati being sued for violating that. So Christopher will be here that night to talk about that. We will have Chris Monzel here to talk about the county. And we will start it out with a potluck dinner and a grill out. And I invite you all to bring a little potluck dish and enjoy yourself for our season-ending event. And then our guest speaker that night will be the great Rocky Boyman, who's a Super Bowl winner. And he's going to talk about the importance of leadership. It's a great session if you have kids or grandkids to bring them to get a great life lesson. So that'll be 2 weeks from last night. So I got corralled by Betty and Bill when I walked in here, and they said, "Don't be so cheap tonight, Dan. Why don't you give away 2 prizes instead of 1? So they caught me in a very weak moment, and we're going to give away 2 prizes to you tonight. The first we're going to give away is our guest's book, Morgan's Great Raid. And he's down to his last 3 books. And what I will tell you is our growing library, there's about 25 books in there now. There's a copy of it in there too. So he was able to let us buy a copy. You're free to take it home and check it out. Please just bring it back. But this is for the book. And if you win, you can get it personalized. He signed it, but you can get it personalized at the end of the session. So for the book, last 3 numbers, number 136. Leslie, right in the front row. Let's congratulate her. And this is the wild card ticket. I'm not going to tell you until you tell me whether you won, what it's for. But it is number 154. 154. The gentleman right back there. You win a night to paint your own twist a week from tonight. So, and your name is? A week from tonight. And your name is? Carl? Howard. Let's give Howard a round of applause. And so I need you to practice your brush strokes over the next week. And after we're done tonight, if you'd come up, we'll give you a little certificate for that, okay? So with that in mind, Betty is going to introduce our guest speaker. Only thing I'm going to ask is that if you have a question, please wait to let our people who are online tonight hear you talk into the microphone so that they can hear you. Thank you.
I just want to mention a couple other things before I introduce our speaker, and that is that we run totally on donations. So we do pass buckets around towards the end of our class, and if you feel led to just give any size donation, we appreciate that. The other thing I want to mention is a lot of our, not a lot, but some of our classes happen because of people like you. Tonight's class happened because David's mother lives in my neighborhood, but I had never met her. She hasn't lived there that long. But one of my friends lives on the same street as her and had met her. And Joanne, being the proud mother that she has, of course, bragged about her son. So that's how I found out about David, and that's how this class came about. And some of our ideas that we have do come from you out there suggesting topics to us. So we encourage you to keep doing that because we do need help. David Mowery has been studying the Civil War for over 35 years, and during the course of this time, he has researched, visited, and site documented over 500 Civil War battlefields across the United States. David has been a member of the Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable since 1995, joining the Ohio Civil War Trail Commission in 2001 to represent Hamilton County's Civil War sites to the state of Ohio. As a member of this volunteer group, he designed and historically validated the 557-mile John Hunt Morgan Heritage Trail of Ohio. David has published 2 books on the subject of Confederate General John Hunt Morgan's Great Raid through Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, including its first campaign study titled Morgan's Great Raid, the remarkable expedition from Kentucky to Ohio, as well as the official guidebook of the John Hunt Morgan Heritage Trail titled Morgan's Raid Across Ohio. David currently serves as the chairman of the nonprofit Buffington Island Battlefield Preservation Foundation, the all-volunteer group working to save Ohio's only major Civil War battlefield. Please give a warm welcome to David Mowery.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'd like to say that, you know, talking in front of a group like this of people who want to learn is one of the greatest joys a man can have, because I know you guys are here to listen, and that's a wonderful thing. I spoke at Ollie earlier this year. UC Ollie has a similar program, and we had a great crowd there too. So I've experienced this type of thing before, and I'm so proud to be able to speak with you tonight. I'd like to go with you through a very famous Civil War raid that became less famous over time. In fact, I think the reason why it became less famous over time is because of the fact that it was overshadowed by things going on at the same time, particularly the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg, which probably every person in this room has heard of at some point in their life. Gettysburg by far is probably the most famous Civil War battlefield in the world. Of course, Morgan's raid occurred right in the same month. So unfortunately, even at that time in the Civil War, Morgan's raid was left behind in the dust by the media. And we know how effective the media is today. It was very effective in the 1860s and became more so as time went on. I'll start first with the inventor of the raid. I think a lot of people get confused about the fact that it's called Morgan's raid, therefore Morgan invented it, right? No, he executed the raid. The inventor of the raid is actually this man behind me. His name is Braxton Bragg. He was general at the time of the Army of Tennessee. The Army of Tennessee was the largest Confederate army west of the Appalachian Mountains. And Braxton Bragg had a very serious situation in June of 1863, the month before the raids began. His situation was dire because he was being faced down by a major army under General William S. Rosecrans, the Army of the Cumberland, which was a Union army commanded by a Cincinnatian. Rosecrans had spent some time here in Cincinnati, and he had been in the Civil War for a while. In fact, he was the one that laid out Camp Dennison on the east side of Cincinnati as a colonel. And so he had an army that was facing down Bragg near Nashville. But Bragg had even worse problems. Toward his western flank on the Mississippi River was Major General Ulysses S. Grant with the Army of the Tennessee. And that army, of course, was surrounding at the time General Pemberton's army of the Mississippi, which was basically bottled up in Vicksburg. And the Vicksburg campaign was nearing an end in June. And then Bragg had a serious problem on the eastern flank, which is along the western flank of the Appalachian Mountains. There he had Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner with a very small force, probably less than 20,000 men, to defend a very critical piece of landscape in the western theater of the Civil War, and that was Cumberland Gap. I hope some of you, if you haven't gone, you got to go to Cumberland Gap sometime in your life. It's a beautiful place, but it's also a very historic place. It is truly the gateway to the West. That's where Daniel Boone went through to settle Kentucky. And that's where all of our ancestors who have been here a long time in Ohio, most of them had families that came through the Cumberland Gap. Well, during the Civil War, the Cumberland Gap continued to be a very important pathway. And Buckner's Confederates could only hold Cumberland Gap so long because there was a new army in the Union being formed in Kentucky. And that new army was called the Army of the Ohio. It had been disbanded in 1862 and been ordered by Abraham Lincoln as president to be reformed under a new commander, Major General Ambrose Burnside. Ambrose Burnside was a failed commander in the field. He had been the first commander of the Army of the Potomac, which was the largest Union army east of the Appalachian Mountains, the one that was protecting Washington and Virginia. He had failed against Robert E. Lee, because Robert E. Lee had a great army, of course, and all of us know Robert E. Lee as a great general. Well, Robert E. Lee licked him very well at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. And afterwards, it wasn't the failure at the battle that made Abraham Lincoln upset. It was the fact that Ambrose Burnside actually blamed his subordinates for the loss. You don't blame your subordinates when you're a commander. It makes your higher commanders somewhat suspect of your leadership. So Abraham Lincoln, being the nice guy he was, didn't relieve Burnside of command. Rather, he gave him probably the best desk job you could get. That's commander of the Department of Ohio. Department of Ohio is headquartered here in Cincinnati. In fact, it was down on 4th Street. And he had his own personal headquarters on 9th Street, exactly where the children's library is at the annex of the public library downtown. That's where he lived. And he often sent messages from there. In March of 1863, he was given that command. And the first thing that Lincoln told him is, Burnside, I want you to reform the Army of Ohio. And I also want to protect our area from the Copperheads. And I'll talk to you more about Copperheads later in the talk. Well, Burnside turned out to be a great desk job general. He was not good in the field, but he was very good at organizational skills. And the Army of Ohio was reforming very fast and very quickly. A lot of new recruits coming in from the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa. They were all pouring in. And so Bragg was getting very uneasy about this man and his new army. Now, before I move on, those nice whiskers you see on Mr. Ambrose Burnside, that's not just a decoration. They were very popular in the 1860s, so much so that Americans were starting to call them Burnsides, or this man. Well, burn has a negative connotation in our lexicon, so eventually Americans do what they do best. They change words. They did it from the British words, why not this one? And they just flipped it. And that's where we get our word sideburns. It came from this man right here. So Braxton Bragg decided to divert the attention of Burnside particularly, but also maybe even William Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland from Nashville, by sending a raid into Kentucky. The thought was, from Bragg's perspective, that a raid into Kentucky, particularly targeted at Louisville, Kentucky, because Louisville was a major Union depot at the time, that it would force these armies to send their cavalry after Morgan. But of course, Bragg had one stipulation from Morgan, and that is you have to stay in Kentucky, because as a cavalryman, I want you to stay behind just in case I need you to protect my flanks and my pickets. Now, Morgan is from Lexington, Kentucky. He was originally born in Huntsville, Alabama, but as a very young boy, his family moved up to Lexington. The reason for that, his father became very poor and couldn't support the family. But Morgan's mother was the daughter of the richest man west of the Appalachian Mountains, John Wesley Hunt, the first millionaire in American history west of the Appalachian Mountains. He had made his fortune in Kentucky. And so, of course, you know, as any good gentleman would do, John Wesley Hunt took his daughter and son-in-law in, along with his grandbaby, and gave the son-in-law a job, and that's how Morgan grew up in the lap of luxury. He grew up in a world of horses, horse breeding. He grew up in a world of business sense and good Southern chivalry. And he never let that leave himself. He loved horses, he loved to ride, he was a fantastic horseman. And he was also an excellent businessman. But the one love in his life was to be a cavalryman or an infantryman or anything in the military for that matter. Unfortunately, at the time, West Point was very cliquish. You couldn't get into West Point unless you knew somebody. And he didn't know enough people. The only chance he got to be in the military was when he was in the Mexican War. He volunteered for a Kentucky mounted unit, and he ended up going to the Mexican War and fighting one battle at Buena Vista, which was a great American victory. He distinguished himself there, and he learned a lot from it, but for the most part, that was his only military experience in his whole career prior to the Civil War. What he learned to do was something he learned on his own, from his own intuition, experiences, and just talking with other people. It's amazing how people can be self-taught, much like Abraham Lincoln. You know, you look at these people in history that self-taught themselves, and they turn out to be spectacular. Morgan's one of them. Morgan was a self-taught special operations commander. Back then, they didn't have a name for special ops. Today, we know the special ops guys primarily through the Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs are special ops. Delta Force, Rangers. These are guys that work behind enemy lines constantly. That's your job, work behind enemy lines. Morgan's job in the Civil War is primarily that, work behind enemy lines. His targets were things, not people. He didn't target armies. He didn't fight battles typically. His job was to raid, target things like warehouses, railroads, steamboats, wagon parks, anything that could be used to transport enemy reinforcements to the front or enemy supplies to the front. If he could capture the supplies and bring them back to his own army, that would be great too. But that's what he did. He was a special ops guy. Back then, they didn't typically have human targets like we do today. But even so, that developed even toward the end of the Civil War. They had human targets. But in this case, Morgan was being asked to do a special operation. That is, go behind enemy lines in Kentucky and divert the attention of a whole army or two to make them stay away from East Tennessee and the Cumberland Gap. That was his mission. That's what Bragg told him to do. But Bragg said, stay in Kentucky. He was very good at this type of job. He had, for the first 2 years of the Civil War, 61 and 62, no one could top Morgan at this type of job. He was a fantastic raider. He had gained a national reputation on both sides of the war, Union and Confederate. He was known as, by the women of the South and the North, as a rock star. They would literally swoon if they saw him. Women were just thought he was the greatest man on earth. He was beautiful. He was very suave when you met him, very soft-spoken, not overbearing. He was extremely chivalrous, and chivalry was still big in the United States in the 1860s. That's why we have this combination of old war and new war and the Civil War. He was very much the epitome of the cavalier, the knight in shining armor, the knight on the white horse. And he was of great reputation amongst military men, except for those who didn't understand the cavalry. And those were the men who fought against him, as well as the men who commanded him, like General Braxton Bragg. West Point did not teach special operations in the 1860s. In fact, they had no clue of how to even deal with the situation of special ops. It had been around since the Bible. There were special ops back in the biblical times, but no one had made it a formal way of warfare. Morgan made it a formal way of warfare for his type of division, and it was very successful. It caused severe problems for the Union Army for the first 2 years of the war, but the Union Army was starting to get up to speed on this. They were starting to understand the value of special operations, but they still called it something that was negative. Guerrilla. Guerrilla had a negative connotation, still is today in many ways. But back then it was really negative because it was associated to a bushwhacker. And a bushwhacker is typically a murderer, someone who steps out of bushes and shoots you for no reason. Murderers, rapists, pillagists, those type of people were known as guerrillas. And he was lumped in amongst them, and his men were lumped up with those guys. And he did not care for that term, obviously, because he was a Southern gentleman. And his men were taught to be Southern gentlemen. And I'll tell you more about that here shortly. One thing I want you to note here, there's two pictures of General Morgan here. One in his formal raiding uniform, which is here, and then one on that shows him in his, what I call his raiding uniform when he's in the field. Because you're working behind enemy lines, you want to blend in with the civilian population. Not only that, every person, whether a soldier or not, becomes a sniper. And if you're a man wearing a Confederate uniform with bright clothes and lots of badges and everything else, you stand out like a sore thumb. The first thing a sniper is going to do is go after the commander. So he wore this. He looked like a typical businessman going to the next town to do business. And he wore, the only thing that distinguished him as a commander is he would wear a feather in his hat. And that's how his men knew that was General Morgan coming. But that's a very important point to make here because his men followed suit, literally. These are some of his men. Now, these aren't enlisted men. These are all officers. Officers usually are dressed up in uniform, right? When you see them in pictures, not these guys. Half of them here are shown up in their raiding uniforms. They're shown up in civilian outfits. Some of them look like farmers straight off the farm field. The reason? Same reason. They could blend in with the civilian population of the enemy. By doing so, they could gather intelligence very easily. No one would hesitate to talk to another farmer to say, if I asked him a question, where is such and such place? Tell me what road I need to take. Oh, you just go up the road this way and go about 5 miles, you'll get there. Now, would you tell that to an enemy? No. But you would tell it to a fellow farmer, right? Because, you know, we're all farmers and or fellow businessmen, you know, we all stick together and take care of each other. That's why they did what they did. Now, a lot of questions have always come up about that. What if you were caught wearing a civilian outfit? Because there's rules about being caught in civilian outfits, particularly are you a spy or not. By that time in the Civil War, most Confederates actually dressed like some of these civilians because uniforms were wearing out and not being replaced as easily in the Confederacy. So the Union Army basically just said, let them go, treat them like normal prisoners of war if you catch them. However, sometimes they were treated as possible spies, and some of them were very close to getting executed. But these guys were very good at what they did. They were mounted infantrymen. They were not cavalrymen. Very important point. Cavalrymen are trained in West Point at that time to carry swords, and their primary duty is to protect the flank and do picket duty. They rarely get into battle. And if they do, they primarily do the massed saber charge. That's what they're trained to do. These men were not trained that way. They were trained to carry an infantry rifle. They were trained to carry 2 Colt pistols on their belt. They had Bowie knives in case there was a close quarters fight. But for the most part, they were carrying the weapons of an infantryman. They threw their swords aside. In fact, the newbies, the green boys who showed up in camp for the first time, a lot of them carried swords into camp, and they would be laughed out of camp by the veterans because they had no clue that this was not a typical cavalry unit you're dealing with here. This is Morgan's Raiders who carried rifles. Their favorite rifle was the 2-ringer Enfield rifle. That was their favorite because it was short-barreled, and they could strap it onto their backs while they're on horseback and easily pulled off their backs in case they were shot at. That was their favorite. And the Colt pistols, of course, were great. Those had been introduced in Texas in the 1850s and swept through the U.S. Army during the Mexican War. And by that time, the Colt pistol was a major piece of weaponry for the typical infantryman and also for the cavalrymen. So these guys were trained to work behind enemy lines by these two gentlemen. On the left, you see Colonel Basil W. Duke. Basil Duke is a very interesting man. He is John Hunt Morgan's brother-in-law. Basil Duke married Morgan's youngest sister before the Civil War started. And they were best of friends. Not only being brothers-in-law, but they were also very good friends. They thought differently, but they clicked like two peas in a pod. Morgan was really the brazen guy. He was the one that gave all the energy and the spirit to something that they did. Basil Duke gave the intelligence, the logic behind everything they did. The two put together was an explosive combination and made for one of the best combinations of partnerships in the Civil War between two commanders. So Morgan always considered Basil Duke his right-hand man. The other man here is Adam Rankin Johnson. He was also from Kentucky. He lived in Texas for a while, fought the Comanches in Texas before the Civil War. He knew the style of guerrilla warfare that the Indians fought with. He learned that also in the Civil War early. He had his own unit called the 10th Kentucky Partisan Rangers, which was the first unit to capture a Union city during the Civil War. In July of 1862, a year before this raid was done here, Adam Rankin Johnson captured Newburgh, Indiana, which is not far from Evansville. And he captured it for a period of about 4 hours. And he did it with 19 men. And he did it against a force of several thousand who were converging on Newburgh. And it was an amazing feat. He crossed the Ohio River to do it. And from that, Morgan learned a lot from Johnson. And he wanted Johnson on his staff for this particular raid because he was going to take the raid further than just Kentucky, like Bragg had said. He needed somebody like Johnson that encouraged him or would at least teach him what are the obstacles about getting over the Ohio River. What are the obstacles about being on Indiana soil? These two men would have a great impact on the raid. Now, Morgan was given his orders in June. Morgan wanted as many men as he could get from his division. He had about a division of roughly about 3,000 men. But Bragg said, no, I'm not going to give you all those men. But eventually, Morgan was able to negotiate with Bragg to get 2,500 men to go with him, 2,500 veterans that fought for him for many years. Along with that, Morgan carried 4 artillery pieces, all field pieces that you would see on any battlefield in the Civil War. He didn't carry the typical artillery pieces cavalry units would use, the small ones. He didn't like those. Instead, he carried the ones that you would use in big battles in the infantry, the ones you would see at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, wherever you went. He carried 2 10-pound Parrotts and 2 12-pound field howitzers. These are typical cannon that you would see on a battlefield today. Well, those 4 cannon went with him the whole way. And the reason he did that, he was mounted infantry. He would fight like infantry when he fought in battle. So it was important to have those cannon in support. Here's a map of his invasion route through Kentucky. Now, at the time, at the southern side of this map, there's a place called Burkesville, Kentucky. Burkesville, Kentucky was on the Cumberland River, not far from the Tennessee border above Nashville. In those days of June of '63, this is roughly about June 25th or so, between June 11th and June 25th, there was a no man's land of many miles between Nashville and the Cumberland River. That no man's land separated Confederate forces from Union forces. Union forces were north of the river. Confederate forces were south of that no man's land. Morgan crossed the no man's land, headed for the Cumberland River, and he knew that as soon as he crossed the Cumberland River, he would be in enemy territory. And at that point, he becomes a special operations commander. And special operations commander, back then, He taught his men this, and they're still taught that today here when special ops commanders are taught today by our U.S. military. Once you cross into enemy lines, you're on your own. You have no support. The best you can do is radio in, and if you're lucky, you might get a support group to come in after you. But in those days, they didn't have a radio. So if you crossed into enemy territory, you had nobody to help you. But you also had nobody to tell you what to do either. And that's what he knew. He realized that once he got across the Cumberland River, General Braxton Bragg could not tell him to stay only in Kentucky. Morgan realized in June, when he planned out this raid, that the only way he could divert the Army of the Ohio away from East Tennessee was to invade the northern states. He had learned that from Johnson's raid in '62, and now he was going to put it to practice. He knew that putting troops onto Indiana, Ohio soil would cause such consternation amongst the politicians in Indiana, Ohio, that they would call out the troops and force Burnside to send everybody he had to go after Morgan and stop him. And he had it down pat. That's exactly what would happen. So what you see on this slide is his path. He moves up from Burkesville, he crosses the river here on July 2nd, 1863, which is the official start of the raid. The raid begins when he enters enemy territory. Any person you talk to in special ops will say your raid begins when you enter enemy territory. It's not when you're preparing for it. He prepared for it for about a week earlier, and unfortunately, a lot of historians count that time into his raid time. That's incorrect. The only time that should be counted is when he's behind enemy lines. So he crosses into enemy lines on July 2nd at Burkesville. There's no Union troops there to stop him. That line should have been protected by the Union cavalry. But instead, because of a major rainstorm, the Cumberland River was half a mile wide, flood deep. But his men crossed it at flood stage, got all 2,500 men, horses, artillery, and supplies across that river in 24 hours. It totally surprised Burnside and his cavalry, and Morgan all of a sudden was heading north at breakneck speed. He enters Kentucky and heads towards Springfield, which is just south of Louisville. This is the man who let the door open for Morgan. He was the one that was supposed to protect the Cumberland River, but he didn't do his job well. And in fact, even when he learned that Morgan had crossed the river, he didn't even reply correctly. He kept many of his Union brigades of cavalry behind and put them in place, thinking that Morgan was just going to come back and cross again. We'll hit him when he tries to recross the Cumberland River. He didn't realize that Morgan was not coming back across the Cumberland River again. He was going to head straight north for the Ohio River. But Judah really made a big mistake here and let Morgan through. This man, however, which is one of Judah's subordinates, did very well. Hobson had fought Morgan for nearly 2 years in Kentucky. He was a Kentuckian, in fact. General Edward Hobson was born and raised in Greensburg, Kentucky, which is along the route of the Morgan's raid here. It's just south of Lebanon, Kentucky. And he's a banker before the war. He raised an infantry unit. He became a cavalryman. And he fought Morgan's men several times. One time almost was captured by them, but he hid in a cave to escape. So he had a vendetta against General Morgan, but more importantly, he knew how Morgan acted. He knew his tricks. He knew his ways of doing special ops maneuvers, his speed. He knew all the little things that made a good raider, and his men were taught the same way. So Morgan had a great fear of General Hobson and his troops because they were really true rivals. Particularly the subordinates under Hobson. These three men were highly trained anti-Morgan troops, I call them. The man on the left here is Colonel August Kautz. He's a pretty well-known cavalryman sent from the Eastern Theater, from the Army of Potomac. He was sent west just to deal with Morgan because Morgan was such a problem to the Union Army. They needed good leaders out there to try to combat him, and Kautz was one of them. The one in the middle there is Brigadier General James Shackelford. He's also Kentuckian. He also suffered from Morgan earlier in the war. He was actually wounded severely in the foot, took him out of the war for several months during a clash with some of Adam Rankin Johnson's men. And he had a vendetta against Morgan and his men. He wanted to see revenge. The man on the right, though, is Colonel Frank Wolford. There's a new book out on him called Wild Wolf. I highly recommend it. Frank Wolford was truly the Moriarty of General Morgan, the Moriarty of Sherlock Holmes. He was the antithesis of what Morgan expected out of a cavalry leader, and he considered him, Frank Wolford, his greatest rival. He and his men, in fact, were Morgan's greatest rivals. The 1st Kentucky U.S. Cavalry. They were Kentuckians, many of them brothers or relatives of Morgan's men. They fought the same way. They could lick pretty much anybody they fought. Morgan considered these guys his greatest rival and his greatest fear. If the 1st Kentucky U.S. Cavalry was anywhere near, Morgan needed to know everything about them. Where were they? How many are there? Can we get away from them quick enough? Because Frank Wolford's there, and I know he'll give me a good battle. So those 3 men were going to chase Morgan for nearly 1,000 miles. And this is one of those men in those units. He is from the 2nd Ohio Cav. There was actually some of this unit was formed here in Cincinnati. This cavalry unit chased Morgan from Burkesville all the way up to where Morgan would eventually surrender, near West Point, Ohio, close to 965 miles. And this man doesn't look like a raider or a man who could compete with a raider like Morgan, but he was. By 1863, he was probably a grizzled vet. He probably had facial hair down halfway down his chest. Probably was maybe a little older looking than in this nice, beautiful picture from 1861. But he knew, and he'd grown into a cavalryman that our U.S. cavalry would emulate for years to come. Now Morgan decides that he's going to not attack Louisville, but instead use Louisville as bait. He makes a solid left turn south of Louisville, a place called Springfield, Kentucky, and heads west directly to the Ohio River, a place called Brandenburg. And there at Brandenburg, which is right here on the Ohio River, about 27 miles downstream from Louisville, he crosses there on the day of July 8th, 1863, and into the evening of July 9th. That crossing was a spectacular crossing because it allowed Morgan to get across the Ohio River before the U.S. Navy was able to block him. From there, he was able to get across southeast Indiana and do it in 6 days. He started on July 9th and got up to Harrison, Ohio by July 13th. So very fast movement. And he reached Sunman, Indiana, just west of Harrison, Ohio, on the night of July 12th, 1863. There he camped for the night before he prepared for his great ride around Cincinnati. Now by this time, his men had traveled for a week, over a week now, and they were averaging 40 miles a day in the saddle. And they were in the saddle 21 out of every 24 hours. So that means they were only getting an average of 3 hours of sleep a day. They were suffering from sleep deprivation. A lot of them would fall out of the saddle and wouldn't even know it. When they landed on the ground, they would still be asleep. They had to have their comrades come and shake them wildly in order to wake them up. And doctors who've heard about this sleep deprivation have said they were suffering from basically sleepwalking symptoms. So these men were in dire need of sleep, but they kept going because their leader, John Hunt Morgan, was so energetic. He kept them moving, kept them going. And he was living off the land. Here at the Ferris Schoolhouse, which is just south of Sunman today, he planned his movement across northern Hamilton County. He realized that to attack a major city was not what a raider would do. Cincinnati was the 7th largest city in the United States at the time of the Civil War. And those were in the days when Brooklyn was a separate city from New York City. So Cincinnati was a major city. It was the largest city west of the Appalachian Mountains besides New Orleans. And it was the largest city in the Union west of the Appalachian Mountains. It also produced some of the largest amounts of war material in the North. It would have been a perfect prize for a raider. But Morgan realized that that wasn't going to do. And the reason? Because of militia. Now, his point was to divert attention away from East Tennessee. What was happening by the time he reached this point? Well, he crossed the Ohio River. It totally befuddled both Bragg and Burnside. Bragg said, "What the heck is he doing?" Burnside says, "What the heck is he doing?" Both of them didn't have any clue of what Morgan was trying to do until a couple days transpired. As soon as Morgan touched Indiana soil, what Morgan predicted came true. Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana called up his militia to stop the rebel invader on my soil. And what happens? 65,000 troops are called into action. Now, those 65,000 troops are mostly untrained soldiers. And I wouldn't even call them soldiers. They're untrained people who carry guns. Most of them were shopkeepers, farmers. And if they were lucky to squirrel shoot once in a while, that's probably the best they ever did with a gun. Most of these men were never trained. And as a result, they had no way to stop Morgan. Morgan had no respect for the militia. He had no issues with 65,000 militia chasing him. He is most concerned about the 2,500 roughly of Hobson's provisional division that was chasing after him. That's who he was most feared of. And he's more feared about the militia slowing him down to allow Hobson to catch up to him. When he reached this point, Hobson was about 5 hours ride behind him, and he was getting too close for comfort. So Morgan said he had to get around Cincinnati as fast as possible. Now, Governor Todd of Ohio does the same thing, but before Morgan reaches Ohio soil. On this day, July 12th, Governor Todd sends out his proclamation to the state and calls out the militia units. Now an additional 60,000 Ohio militia would be engaged. Now, if you do the addition here, for those who know math and are good at math, we have 60,000 Ohio militia plus 65,000 Indiana militia plus 2,500 regular cavalrymen. What does that add up to be? Close to 130,000 troops. Now we have to include the U.S. Navy now too, because the U.S. Navy, after Morgan got across the Ohio River, they were so embarrassed. Lieutenant Commander Leroy Fitch of the Mississippi Squadron, he's in control of the whole Ohio River. He is so embarrassed that he's called out most of his gunboats on the Ohio River to go after Morgan, prevent him from crossing the Ohio River. So now you have to count all the sailors involved in the U.S. Navy chase. So add another probably 500 men, at least. You're getting close to 130,000 Union troops. So do you think Morgan's achieving his objective after 2 weeks in the saddle? I would say he is. This is where his men camped that night. It's a cemetery right across the street from that old house. That was a schoolhouse at one time, that house I showed you there behind the monument. It's now a private residence. And Sunland here is interesting because it was only 2 miles away from the Confederate camp, and there were 2,500 Union militia on a railroad train sitting here all night, 2 miles away. And they knew Morgan was somewhere in the area. You would have thought there would have been some kind of skirmishing that night. Well, there's lots of theories of why they didn't, because a lot of Union militia were just so untrained that first sight of a Confederate veteran, they would run. And a lot of the military commanders in Indiana thought, well, he's heading for Ohio anyway. Let's not try to sacrifice any lives. let David Todd take care of it. You know, pass the buck. Well, this is how I tracked Morgan's route and Hobson's route. Morgan's route's in red, Hobson's route's in blue here. I use something called the Morgan raid claims, which are available online for free for all of you. You just go to archive.org and you put in Morgan raid claims, and the Ohio raid claims come up. There's also a set of Morgan raid claims for Indiana, but those are not online. You have to go to the Indiana Historical Society in Indianapolis to get a copy of those. But from that, it's like leaving popcorn, because what Morgan was doing to keep his speed going was living off the land, much like the March to the Sea that Sherman would do a year later. He would live off the civilians rather than carry a wagon train with him to slow him down. Wagon trains were very slow because wagons got stuck in the mud. The mules pulling the wagons had to stop to poop once in a while, and that would take several minutes, if not half an hour. They had to stop for drink, and they had to stop for eating, and that was like 4 or 5 times a day sometimes. And that wagon train would just take forever to get through. But his cavalrymen were placing horses along the line to keep them fresh, and they were stealing fodder from the farmers out of their barns, so hay and oats and such. They were also taking food from the civilians, so they didn't have to carry food along with them. They would take whatever they could grab, like a biscuit or a cup of buttermilk, or whatever, take it with them on the horse, like carry out food, and go on their way. And that way they could maintain that pace of 40 miles a day, which is unusual. A typical horse, even today, unless it's a really specialized, well-trained horse, a typical horse, if it's a thoroughbred, can go about 20 miles a day without rest. A typical workhorse, like on the farm, would probably go about 10 miles a day. So 40 miles a day, you're wearing out horses very quickly to almost death. A lot of these horses were left behind almost to near death. But they would replace them with new horses they would find on the farmer's farm, or from when they're going to town, they'd steal from the businessmen's carriages and just take them along. And sometimes they'd take the whole carriage along with them if they wanted to. This is unfortunately one of those who lost their horses to Morgan's men. This house is just west of Harrison, at a place called Hubbell's Crossroads. Joseph Buchert, very German name. He owned this inn, and he lost a horse to Morgan's men. Now, Morgan was targeting things like railroads. He burned this railroad station today. The interesting thing is, though, Morgan did not burn very many bridges or things along the way. Even though he was a raider, his primary mission was to divert Union troops, not to burn things. So we don't see a lot of things being burned along Morgan's route. Even though that was the propaganda of the day, the newspaper says he was burning and pillaging and raping and all this stuff. None of that was happening because Morgan had one objective: divert Union troops. The whiskey. So what do soldiers love? They love spirits, right? Have been since the beginning of time. Well, Morgan's men, though, didn't use whiskey the same way as typical soldiers used whiskey. Whiskey made you drunk if you drank too much of it, right? Well, Morgan's men understood that. They were veterans, but they were behind enemy lines. Getting drunk is not a good situation behind enemy lines. If you get drunk and you're stone cold dead for the night, you're going to get captured the next morning by an anxious militiaman who wants to capture a rebel. Give him a good name, you know? So it's really important to know that whiskey was not used to get drunk by Morgan's troops. It was used for medicinal purposes primarily. When you're sitting in the saddle for 21 hours, what happens to your butt? You have butt sores, right? And they hurt after a while. Whiskey calms it down. What happens if you start feeling ill? Take some whiskey. It might help. The hot toddy, for those who, the old days of getting the hot toddy when you feel cold coming on. That's what they used it for. So it was mainly medicinal. It's also used for wounds, helping with wounds. Another reason for this too, veterans of the Civil War understood by 1863 that drinking water was a bad thing. They realized that a lot of people were just getting sick when we were around rivers and creeks. They didn't know why, but there was just some kind of affiliation with bad water. So these men would not go after water. The first thing they would go after was milk and buttermilk. And that's the reason why they're behind enemy lines. If they get sick, they're doomed. They're going to go to prison. So the milk and buttermilk was less likely to have organisms in it that would make them sick, like typhoid fever, which was the #1 killer in the Civil War, or even dysentery. So unfortunately, Anthony Blaitner lost his whiskey to some of Morgan's men, and horses were not taken just from the civilians, but also from anybody, like a priest, a Catholic priest. He lost 4 of his horses here at St. Paul's Catholic Church. And then you have the Gephardt Saloon, which is just down the street, 2 houses down from the other saloon we just saw in New Alsace, Indiana, which boasted at the time close to 50 saloons. Believe it or not, I could not believe that number, but yes, it was true. Jacob Gephardt owned this saloon, and Morgan took a rest in it. And the way they would do this is this. The column would keep moving. Morgan would get to the front of the column, get out, go to the saloon here, and he would take a rest in the bed of the owner. And he would may even pay for it. Sometimes he wouldn't, but sometimes he would. He'd take a rest for about 3 hours until the end of the column was reached, and then he would have somebody wake him up, and he would join the back end of the column. So that's how you got a 3-hour nap. Here, the Hammerley Hotel, there was a lost horse here, one of many. It still stands today at this place in Dover, Indiana. And of course, Logan's Crossroads is just a little bit east of Dover, and between Dover and Harrison. There, William McClure lost his horse, and his house is there. Now, as we proceed toward Harrison and the border between Indiana and Ohio, we see that Hobson's right behind him. But Hobson's going to have to go a different route, because when Morgan crosses the Whitewater River at Harrison, he's going to burn it behind him. And this would slow down Hobson. Morgan normally did not burn bridges unless it had strategic value, particularly at slowing down those who were chasing him or would be able to cut him off. In this case, the Whitewater River Bridge was a perfect target. So he burned it down, and it did slow Hobson down for several hours, forcing Hobson to spend the night in Harrison that night on July 13th. Now Morgan, when he first arrives, around noon on July 13th in the state of Ohio here at Harrison, he decides to meet up with Colonel Basil Duke and Colonel Adam Rankin Johnson and discuss the plan he had made. There were some arguments about attacking Cincinnati and even some arguments about attacking Hamilton, but both were quickly rejected. Morgan said, we need to get around Cincinnati as fast as possible. In fact, I'm going to order us to do a night march, a very dangerous march, because it's in enemy territory, it's in one of the largest cities in the United States, and the roads are going to be confusing. But I think if we do this tonight, if we get around Cincinnati, we're going to avoid all the troops that Governor David Todd has raised so far. In fact, there were 10,000 Union troops already formed in downtown Cincinnati and around the Hamilton area by the time Morgan reaches Harrison. So Burnside is getting itchy because Morgan's only 27 miles away. And he's afraid that Morgan's going to attack Burnside's headquarters. Can you imagine that showdown? So the discussion occurs in here, and Morgan decides on this night ride. Several hours later, after Morgan's troops depart, Hobson arrives here and makes it his headquarters. And unfortunately, the owner of this place, the American House Hotel, has to cook meals for Morgan soldiers and Hobson soldiers. And he had to give up his horses and fodder to these guys, both sides. One has to realize that Hobson's troops were doing identically the same thing. In order to keep that pace of 40 miles a day, Hobson was also living off the land which meant he was living off the civilians. He was stealing horses. Hobson's troops were stealing food, saddles, boots, whatever they needed to keep moving, and fodder as well for their horses. This is a business district that got highly hit that day, on July 13th, by both sides. Morgan first, his troops took a lot of different things, like from this gray building that you see on the left. That's the old Fisher building. That was a leather goods store that his men took anything they needed from the leather goods area that they needed, such as boots, shoes, saddles, bridles. Those were typical things that wore out very quickly on the ride. He also had his men take anything that they could carry away as food, particularly this nice little bakery here, right here. William Vincent's bakery was raided. He lost all of his cakes and cookies, and biscuits, anything that they could carry away. But also at the same time, they were taking other things besides things that were necessary. His men were also taking things such as ice skates, canaries in a bird women's hats and veils, and bolts of calico and silk. Why are they taking these things? They have no value to the military and nothing to keep them in the saddle. Why were they taking these things? Well, I figured it out over time. It was, after reading the accounts from the soldiers, it was very clear that they were taking these things thinking that they would make it back to the Confederacy, and they could take these things back to their honeys and sweethearts and their moms back home and to the kids. It's like going on a business trip. You want to bring gifts back home to your family. It's the same thing. Same thing. Absolutely same thing. Except the problem was they were moving so fast and they were so tired, eventually they just flung them along off to the side of the road, and then became a great trail for Hobson to follow. They could just follow the toys. Now here's where the Whitewater River Bridge stood, about 300 yards up from the State Line Road Bridge. It went up in flames. And Morgan continued. Now this is a hard one to read, so I don't expect you to be able to see this, except maybe those online might be able to read it. The main thing here is to look at the lines, the red solid lines, the red dotted lines, the blue solid lines, and the blue dotted lines. They represent Morgan and Hobson, respectively. What you get out of this is the tactic that Morgan used when he was in enemy territory to forage, to steal from the civilians. In other words, it's technically called foraging in military terms. What he did is he had one main column following what we call the main route. That's the solid red line. And then he sent his foragers out on the flanks. Those are the dashed red lines. And they would move in parallel with the solid red line, or the main column. And then they would rendezvous. Like in this case, they rendezvoused at a place called Schwing's Corner, which is where Blue Rock and Springdale roads come together today. That is Schwing's Corner. That was a rendezvous point. They also rendezvoused at Beavis, which is where Northgate Mall is. Those foragers would come together at the rendezvous point and bring back all the spoils they had gotten to the main column. And then people in the main column would exchange. So they would become the foragers, and the foragers would become the main column. And they would just keep moving that way across an area. It gave them multiple homes and businesses to raid. It gave them speed, because just like water in a single pipe versus water in multiple pipes, water flushes quicker when it's in multiple pipes moving parallel. Same thing with human beings on horses. We also had protection of the flanks from possible attack, from a flank attack, militia, or regular army units. Now, Morgan's first skirmish in the state of Ohio, which is considered the first skirmish of the Civil War in the state of Ohio, was at Miamitown. Morgan sent 500 men down there to burn that bridge, and also to make a diversion, a feint towards Cincinnati to trick Burnside into thinking that Cincinnati was a target. By the time he reaches here at 6 p.m., these 500 men come to the covered bridge, and they find that the planks have been pulled out. It turns out that there's 23 Union militia there trying to defend that bridge. No match for 500, right? Well, it turns out those 23 men are under Major Bill Rainey he is a Cincinnati police detective. And he's going to defend that bridge to his life because he doesn't want to see it go up in flames. Sure enough, those 500 men find a fording spot to get around the planks that are left out of the bridge. And they come up, and as soon as they get up on the other side of the river, Rainey's 23 men let loose to volley. The 500 men are so surprised that they fall back temporarily and then regain themselves and make a charge, and they push 23 men out into the woods, and they disappear. But in the meantime, they're so shocked by this attack that they think it's a larger number of men than just 23. And so they skedaddle and head north and don't burn the bridge. So those 23 men were able to save that bridge. I call it the Thermopylae of the Morgan raid. Those 23 men were able to save that bridge. That's the Harrison Turnpike today. Now, Morgan also came up sometimes with pacifists, and the Whitewater Shakers were pacifists. They didn't really want to side with either the Union or the South, but they lived peacefully with their comrades, and they wanted to be left in peace. Well, Morgan's Raiders didn't decide to leave them in peace. Instead, they came and visited them on July 13th to look up for horses and also look up food and such, anything they could use. They knocked on the door of the Shaker house, and this is what typifies Morgan's men. They wouldn't act very aggressively with civilians. They were told by Morgan that you have to treat civilians as if they were friends, or as if they were strangers that you wished favors from. I expect that from each of you, and if I hear of any type of harm being made to a citizen, particularly a woman or a child, you will be shot on the spot. That was a general rule in Morgan's troops, and they lived to that ideal. So when they knocked on the door of the Shakers, they politely bowed and lowered their hat and says, "Ma'am," or "Sir," whoever opens the door, they'll say, "May you show us where your horses are kept, and may we have some food, please." They're very polite about it. And so they would often give them food because it was a custom in those days. Of course, very Christian-oriented society in the 1860s, so you would always help a stranger in need, no matter who it was, even if it was an enemy. And they would often invite the enemy into their house and feed them. The Shakers did this, believe it or not. And they were very polite about it, the Raiders were, and they left there, and they took 2 of their horses with them, but they didn't harm any of them, and they left them be. And then they left on their own. Well, several hours later, Indiana Legion troops arrive. They aren't so polite. In fact, the leader of the Indiana Legion that was there at the time was a captain from Indianapolis. And he went up to the door and found out that Elder Rubush, who had lost his horses, he asked for horses for his own troops. And Elder Rubush said, "Well, no, Morgan just took all mine. I don't have any horses left." Well, Rubush didn't take that as an excuse. The captain didn't take that as an excuse from Rubush. So he raised his pistol to Rubush's head, cocked his pistol, and says, "You will give us horses or you will die on the spot here." Well, Rubush was able to find some horses from some of his fellow Shakers, and they gave them to appease the Union Legion troops. And they left very upset, of course, that these Union troops had done this to them. And he recorded all this in a letter only like 5 days later. So we have all this information from Elder Rubush from firsthand about what happened. But that shows you war. War is often written about by the victors, and they often make the enemy, the scoundrels, the marauders, they're the monsters. But in this case, it's the total opposite. It's the victors in this case that were actually the monsters. Now, Morgan burnt this bridge over the Great Miami River. It's near a place called New Baltimore today. The remnants of that bridge are right here. He did that to, again, slow down Hobson. But that was the only bridge he burnt over the Great Miami River. It lit up the sky that night. It was about 7:30 at night. That's before we had daylight savings time, so it was about 8:30 summertime. about the time when we start seeing the sun go down in July. And it was starting to get dark, so that when that sky lit up from that burning bridge, Burnside could see it all the way down in Cincinnati. And he was afraid that Morgan was burning towns. Morgan did not burn any towns, as I mentioned. In fact, he burned hardly anything. He just happened to burn this bridge. This rendezvous point I mentioned before at Camp Coleraine at Beavis, this was a camp early in the Civil War. It was disbanded in August of '61, but several Union troops were formed here. It's at the Kroger's right across the street from Northgate Mall. Now, this night ride that Morgan's going to attempt really left an indelible mark on his men. They had never done anything like this before in the war, and I don't believe they ever did it again. They really were truly affected by this, but it was one of their greatest achievements as soldiers in Morgan's division. Lieutenant Kelly and Petticoat call it the darkest of all nights, and there was a reason for that. First of all, it was a new moon evening. The new moon was the very next day, July 15th. That was coming on a couple days, actually. And Morgan had ordered no torches to be lit because torches would give away their position to the enemy. So they had to ride during the night without torches, which meant they had to ride in the severe dark. No moon, just going in the dark and hoping you could find your person ahead of you. You could see them. And it was an incredible journey. And not only that, they were suffering from sleep deprivation. What happens when you get in complete darkness, when you're tired? You know, you're immediately asleep. These guys had a hard time that night keeping themselves awake, but they were so good at it. By that time, they had learned to go in pairs, and one man would hold the horse to the other while the man slept in the saddle for 30 minutes, and then he'd wake him up, and then they would exchange, and they would hold the other one while the other man slept for 30 minutes, and they would alternate during the night that way. So that's how they got a nap every 30 minutes. Now, this sign I put up with the help of the city of Springdale, to mark Morgan's raid through Springdale. They arrived here at midnight on July 13th. Morgan arrives first with one of his 4 brothers that accompanied him on the raid, Colonel Richard Morgan. And they went to the home of Butcher Watson, which no longer stands. And Morgan's pretty tired. In fact, several people have said he looked aloof, which is unusual because he's very energetic. He had spent the night going up and down the line, joking with his men, ordering them to stay awake for cause and country. He was just a man of energy beyond belief. His men were just dumbfounded by this, but it caught up to him. He's a human being. So he started getting sleepy. He stopped at Butcher Watson's and asked for some food from Butcher Watson. Richard Morgan accompanied him into the house. Well, Butcher Watson says, I can't cook you anything. I don't have any wood for the fire. Well, General Morgan was not up for this. He said, well, mister, if you don't find some wood and make a fire, I'll have my men make a fire for you, and you may not be able to put it out. Very quickly, General Morgan got Butcher Watson to make him some food and a fire. So to combat the big gap that had been formed during the night, he waited there for about an hour and then moved on to his most important place of concern, and that was Glendale, right here. And the importance of this place was the railroad, the Hamilton-Dayton Railroad. That Cincinnati-Hamilton-Dayton Railroad, CHD, was one of the railroads he had targeted even in June of '63 as one of the most important places where he could have a potential battle with major numbers of Union forces. He gets there, though, and all of his tricks of sending troops in different directions and sending misleading wires, which I'll tell about in a few minutes, had tricked General Burnside so much that Burnside did not use the railroad to transport troops to get in front of him. Instead, he sent those troops all the way up to Hamilton. And as a result, when Morgan reaches Glendale at 1 in the morning on July 14th, there's not a single Union soldier in that town. He arrives there, it's so quiet like a mouse that he wakes up the girls in the Glendale Female Academy. who look out and they see these ghostly images of men on horses riding by on Sharon Road. And at that time it was cobblestone, so it was making this awful clicking sound. And that clicking sound and the sight of those men that looked like ghosts scared them. And these little girls ran back and ran under their covers to hide. What it turned out to be was all those women's veils that were stolen in Harrison, Morgan's men used them to cover their faces from the dust, from the July dust going into their eyes. It prevented the dust from getting in their mouth and eyes. Great use of women's veils for men. Now Morgan reaches that point and he's elated. No Union troops. He's going to get his whole division of now only about 2,000 men left that was originally 2,500. He's going to head east and head across eastern Hamilton County. And as you see, his forgers have a grand time. In Glendale, he also makes use of this man, Lightning Ellsworth, a private in Morgan's division. And he is famous not as a soldier, but as an electronic warfare man. He is, in fact, one of our first inventors, if not the first inventor of electronic warfare in America and in the world. When we had Lightning Ellsworth get on the wire, it turned out that he was actually trained by Samuel Morse himself, the inventor of the telegraph. He had the knack also of being able to understand the clicking rhythm of a telegraph operator and be able to replicate it without listening to it more than 2 minutes or so. So he would get on this telegraph, listen to the operator from the Union Army, and listen to their fist or tapping rhythm, which would give other operators the understanding that, oh, it's Joe on the line or John on the line. Each person had an identity associated with their fist. Well, Lightning would learn this fist, shove this operator aside, then replicate it, and give false messages out to the Union operators across the line. By doing so, he confused Burnside so much that Burnside had no idea what was true or what was false coming over the line. It worked perfectly and caused Burnside to not be where he needed to be. Now, here at the Miami Canal Bridge, it went up in flames on July 14th. And soon after, Morgan had to celebrate at the 12 Mile House, which was run by a copperhead. His name was Christopher Meyer. And Christopher Meyer was going to show Morgan his appreciation for the South by bringing up his best bottle of brandy. Well, Morgan and his officers immediately recognized this guy as a copperhead, as a Southern sympathizer, essentially. He was going to make fun of him because they did not like Southern sympathizers. They thought they were cowards and they were traitors. So he was going to take advantage of this guy. He took his bottle of brandy, drank it all down, and then he ended up taking 4 boxes of cigars and 2 horses from Christopher Meyer and left without paying for them. And later on, Christopher Meyer said publicly that he would never support the South again. And here at the John C. Hunt House in Blue Ash, poor Mr. Hunt stood up there with his 10-year-old Wilson, his son Wilson, and watched as 6 of his horses went bye-bye with General Morgan's soldiers. Wilson Hunt said, "Daddy, what are you going to do?" Well, he looked to his son and says, "You can't stop an army." This is one of my favorite stories. Now, it's breakfast time on July 14th, about 5:30 in the morning. Morgan arrives here, and he shows up here, though, after his scouts arrive. 2 scouts arrive at the door, and they knock on the door, pleasantly bow to the lady who opens the door. The lady is wearing nurse's garb, and they ask politely for the horses and the food. Of course, who asked for the horses? Well, it's the soldiers wanting these horses, and the nurses, the woman in nurse's garb points over to the barn and says, "There's 2 old nags in the barn, but you probably won't be able to use them. They weren't rideable. And I could serve you food, but you're going to have to stay out in the front lawn. We have a sick child in the parlor." Well, the men look around, they see these white sheets on the parlor windows and the door, and it turns out back in those days, that meant quarantine, do not enter. So they believed the lady. There was someone sick in there with something very bad, smallpox likely. So they stayed outside and they fed them. About 15 minutes later, General Morgan and his entourage arrive. They ask for the same thing. They get food. These women serve Morgan out on the lawn. And 15 minutes later, they all get out of there because they're on the move. They're trying to stay away from Hobson. But it turns out, during that 30 to 40 minutes that Morgan's troops were there, in that parlor were 2 prize stallions worth $2,000 each, on straw, being quieted by a family of 4 escaped slaves, keeping them quiet. Now, Morgan has to get around Camp Dennison, and this is not going to be easy, but he's going to try his luck and see if he can capture it. It doesn't work out. Colonel Neff defends these crossroads very well with some of his convalescent troops who are recovering from wounds and sickness at Camp Dennison. It works perfectly. He thought they were militia, and they turned out they weren't, and he saves them. And this is where the Union militia position was located, on the hill right above Lowell Madeira Road and Cougar Mill Road, where those two come together. Morgan goes around through Montgomery, rendezvous there with Duke and Johnson, and eventually crossed the Little Miami River at a place called Porter's Mill Ford, which was described in some Confederate accounts as a creek. That's how low it was at the time. They get across the ford, and they go into Claremont County. Now, their job is to head southeast toward Williamsburg. That's going to be where they're going to camp for the night. Meanwhile, they're foraging. His men derail a troop train that comes down toward Camp Dennison, and it was not intentional. They put a barricade in the railroad, the Little Miami Railroad, to prevent trains from getting to Camp Dennison. But instead, the engineer didn't see it quick enough. He put on full steam and hit the barricade and flipped over the locomotive and the tender. But fortunately, the passenger car stayed on the track. So no one was hurt other than the engineer and the fireman. Meanwhile, they marched those who were on the train, which were a bunch of troops that were militiamen. They marched them without a shot being fired up to Morgan's headquarters, and there Morgan paroled them because he didn't like to keep prisoners. They slowed him down. So he paroled all of his prisoners. Then there was some skirmishing at the Madisonville Pike Bridge near Miamiville. Morgan knew that this man was defending the camp, and he did it successfully. In fact, in a 3-hour fight, Lieutenant Colonel George Neff was able to get the better of Morgan, was able to save the camp from destruction and also save the Little Miami Railroad Bridge. This was Neff's headquarters, the only remaining building from Camp Dennison today. It stands there on Lincoln Road near the bike trail, the Loveland Bike Trail. This is a map of that battle. And of course, on July 14th, the skirmish at the Little Miami River Bridge occurred where this bridge is today. This is the Loveland Bike Trail Bridge over the Little Miami River at Miamiville. Neff became a hero, and 6 days later, he was promoted to full bird colonel. Unfortunately, the locals didn't get the best of it here, and August Oskamp lost 43 sheep to Morgan's men. Yes, sheep were good food. He also lost all of his horses because he was a horse breeder. Another thing that went up in smoke was a local Camp Shady, that Neff could not get all of his troops out of. He got his men out, but he couldn't get all of his wagons out, and those wagons went up in smoke. And love and war, typical. Love exists in war just like anything else. And Raider John Anderson and his buddy knock at the door of the Deerwester farm, and young Catherine opens the door, and John looks into her eyes, and she looks back, and they instantly fall in love. And John said, I'm going to come back and marry you. And he told his buddy, we're not stealing the horses from here, because if I marry this girl, I don't want my future father-in-law to hate me and prevent it. So we're not going to take any horses from this farm. They didn't. They only took food. And Catherine was agreeable to this. And so John did survive the war. He went to prisoner of war camp, but he did survive. And in 1866, came back and married her, and they lived happily ever after. This is Hobson's camp. Unfortunately, this is being destroyed as we speak. It's being made into a subdivision today. Snipers, as I said, were both soldiers and non-soldiers. In this case, it was an old War of 1812 vet, got his old musket from the War of 1812 and took a snipe at Morgan. Well, Morgan ordered his troops to go up and get that man, bring him down. They dragged him down, but the punishment was not death. Instead, something even worse. They forced him to ride bareback on an old bony nag for 30 miles and forced him to walk the way home. You can imagine what that was like after 30 miles without a saddle. That poor guy was feeling it. And Governor John Patterson, one of our future governors of the state of Ohio, was a young boy when Morgan came through Owensville, Ohio. And he was so enraged by all this that he joined up in the Union Army the year later when he was of age. Well, Morgan reaches the big field in Williamsburg and he makes his first camp in the state of Ohio. This ride around Cincinnati is the longest continuous cavalry ride in American military history in enemy territory. 85 miles in 35 hours nonstop. No other mounted horseman group has ever accomplished that. And they stayed at places like the John Lytle House, and Morgan stayed here at the Kane House, which has now been destroyed and replaced by a pizza place. But there he was elated. Morgan had circumvented the 7th largest city in the United States successfully. Now, Morgan's trip through Ohio did not go very well. He tried to find a way across the Ohio River. It did not work out. He fought the Battle of Buffington Island on July 19th, several days later, and he was heavily defeated there. Lost nearly half his force, all of his artillery. Colonel Basil Duke was captured there along with several of his officers. It was a complete disaster. Morgan tried to find for the rest of his men a way across the Ohio River. It didn't work out. But he did make it all the way up to a place called West Point, Ohio, which is barely 80 miles from Cleveland. And there he surrendered with only 364 men of his original 2,500 men. Only 500 men of the Confederate force made it back to the Confederacy. The rest were all captured or killed or wounded. And these were the men responsible for capturing him. You notice James Shackelford there on the right. He is one of those 3 men I originally told you about in Hobson's division. And George Rue, he's actually from Hamilton, Ohio. He led a Kentucky unit at the time. Rue is considered the captor of John Hunt Morgan. Well, Morgan ends up going to the Ohio State Pen with 68 officers. Not a place that's typically used for a POW prison, but it works to his advantage. On the night of November 27th, 1863, Morgan, escapes with 6 officers by tunneling out of the Ohio State Pen. He gets over the wall, takes a train down to Cincinnati, gets off, crosses the Ohio River by paying a boy 50 cents to get across the Ohio River in his rowboat, and he gets back to the Confederacy using the reverse Underground Railroad. And he ends up back in Confederate lines. He gains a new division, but a year later, he is killed in battle at the Battle of Greenville, Tennessee on September 4th, 1863, shot in the back by a Union soldier from Tennessee. And he dies as a great cavalier and a great special ops man. So thank you very much for the talk, and appreciate you following the John Hunt Morgan Trail.
What a fascinating talk, being from Glendale. That was pretty cool seeing him go through there. We've got time. We're running a little bit late, but we're going to take just a couple quick questions. We have an online question from Tom. How did Hobson learn raiding techniques?
Hobson learned it from experience, basically being the butt of Morgan. When you get banged around enough, you learn how to bang back, right? That's what happened. Hobson learned from experience.
Who else has a question for our speaker tonight? Anybody? Anybody have a question for our speaker tonight? Okay, right back here.
This is Mike. You called, they were known as guerrillas. Did he ever work with Anderson, the guerrillas from out in Kansas and that area?
No, but some of his men defected to Anderson's guerrillas, mostly associated to the murders and rapists and such from Kansas, Western Kentucky and such. Some of Morgan's former soldiers went there, but they were disowned. Once they left to go to that group, they never were able to come back because they definitely had a negative reputation. They did murder and steal and rape. Morgan's troops never did that on Morgan's raid. There's no documentation of any such negative activity like that. There were a few civilians killed along the Great Raid that were men, but normally they were either ones taking pot shots at Morgan's troops, or they were men that didn't want to shut up with their four-letter words. You know, they were basically just calling out these Confederates with four-letter words, and when they asked to stop, they wouldn't stop. And that angered the Southern chivalry and within them, and they felt that, you know, it was like having a duel. It's time to get back at them.
Any other questions? Right here.
Yes.
I'm Gene.
Hi, Gene.
Is there a connection between Gerald Morgan and Morgan horses?
Not that I know of. There may be, but I don't know of that connection.
Any other questions? I've got to say, we'll take one last question right here.
Pauline, I just want to know, are there any descendants around still?
Of General Morgan?
Uh-huh.
No.
No?
He had one daughter that survived, and she married a young man from, I believe it was Kentucky. They ended up living in Kentucky around Louisville. And within a year of being married, before she could have any type of children, she died of typhoid fever. So Morgan has no direct descendants. Her name was Johnny Morgan. She was the, let's see, it would have been the second child of John Hunt Morgan. The first child died young, and Johnny lived until she was a young woman, but did not survive.
Let's thank our guest again for coming tonight.
Thank
you very much.
Very much.
I've just got to say, we've had in the 300 classes we've taught over 15 semesters, we've had a lot of history classes. This, without a doubt, is one of the clearest, best presentations we've ever had. Let's thank him again. The guy was great. And I just want to remind you all that if you liked what you saw tonight, tomorrow about after 12, you can go on empoweryouohio.org and you can tell your friends about it, and they can just watch it, and the clarity is incredible. It's just really out there. We hope to see you at one of our next events. Have a great night. Thank you so much for coming.
No, that works good. I would like to do that. That's very helpful to know how much.
It is. It's
Hunt Road State.
That's why he knows it all.